Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. The topic of today's video is dispensationalism. Now, dispensationalism is a theological system that is known for making a sharp distinction between Israel and the church and claiming that Israel and the church are two different divine peoples with two different divine plans, and the emphasis that the God's blessings by and large are focused not on the New Testament church but instead on the people of Israel. And dispensationalism is also best known for its eschatology, known as futurist eschatology, which is well known due to its belief in a pre-tribulation rapture, followed by a 7-year tribulation where one man, a politician of great renown and repute, will rise onto the scene as the Antichrist, and he leads the world into worshiping him in the image of the beast, and the peoples of the world receive a mark as part of that worship, and the Antichrist makes a deal with the Jews, a peace deal, which he then breaks midway into the tribulation, and then the tribulation comes to a dramatic climax with the Battle of Armageddon and the return of Christ, which is then followed by Christ reigning for 1,000 years literally on the earth, and Israel being the dominant nation over the entire world during Christ's millennial reign. And that is the most popular form of eschatology that has been held throughout the entire 20th century, and even to this very day, it is arguably still the most widely held view on eschatology in evangelical Protestantism. And this theological system has been held by some very prominent theologians that are at the forefront of mainstream evangelicalism. Some names in the 20th and 21st century that have held this view have included Charles Ryrie, Charles Swindoll, also more commonly known as Chuck Swindoll, David Jeremiah, and perhaps the most famous and popular of them all, John MacArthur. And dispensationalism is still a very prominent held view in dispensationalism, but what is not known to many is that the form of dispensationalist eschatology known as Futurism actually has its origins in the Jesuit order and in the theology of Roman Catholicism. And for 500 years since the Protestant Reformation, and even before Martin Luther pinned his 95 Theses onto the church door in Wittenberg, Protestants believed universally that the Pope of Rome was indeed the Antichrist. And the theological system of eschatology that was held by Protestants for 500 years was known as historicism. But the Jesuits, wishing to lead Protestants away from their identification of the Pope as the Antichrist, came up with two systems of eschatology to counter the commonly held historicist view. And one was called Futurism, and the other one was called Preterism. And Futurism puts all of the prominent prophecies regarding the Antichrist at the end of history, just before Christ returns, in what becomes known as the 7-year tribulation. Hence its name, Futurism, because all of the prophecies will be fulfilled at some point in the distant future. In contrast, Preterism is the view that either most or all of the biblical prophecies in the Bible were fulfilled in the 1st century AD, and that the Antichrist was a figure in the 1st century. It is usually known as the Roman Emperor Nero. But concentrating on Futurism, this view of eschatology eventually entered into Protestantism and became known as dispensationalism. And in 1580, a Jesuit priest named Francisco Ribera, who taught at the University of Salamanca and was a confessor to the Saint Teresa of Avila, a well-known Jesuit academic and theologian, he wrote his commentary on the book of Revelation, where he said that the Antichrist would be a future figure that would come at some time in the distant future before Christ returned, and would have a 3.5-year tribulation reign, which is similar to the 7-year tribulation of dispensationalism that's divided into two halves, each 3.5 years long. And another Jesuit who promoted the view of futurism regarding the Antichrist was the well-known Jesuit leader called Robert Bellarmine. And then a third Jesuit priest named Emmanuel Lacunza was the man who famously came up with the doctrine of the pre-tribulation rapture. And it would be many centuries before these views would fully enter into Protestant circles, but with time this did indeed come to pass. And one man who promoted the view of the pre-tribulation rapture was a man named Edward Irving, who operated at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. And he was a forerunner to the start of the system that became known as dispensationalism. But the man who is most well known as the father of dispensationalism was a man named J.N. Darby, and he really began to promote the views of futurism and dispensationalism. And he was a leader of a group that emerged called the Plymouth Brethren, and really his ministry became active around the time of 1836 and onward. So it was really in the 19th century when these views began to enter into Protestant circles. But it was at the beginning of the 20th century, the views would become even more well known because of a man known as C.I. Scofield. And Scofield really popularized and systematized the views that became known as dispensationalism due to his writing of the Scofield Reference Bible, which was a Bible which had study notes, so it was, in a sense, a study Bible. And his study Bible, with the Scofield reference notes, came out in 1909, and it became widely popularized in the United States and also across the ocean in the United Kingdom. And this led to the rise of dispensationalism becoming the dominant viewpoint in most evangelical Protestant circles in the early 20th century. And it is well known that Scofield had some very sketchy connections to globalists and Zionists and other groups, where there have been many people who have alleged in their writings that Scofield was himself a Freemason or even perhaps a member of the Illuminati. Even though my research wasn't able to verify this, it has been verified that when he was the pastor of his congregational church in Dallas, that he had at least one prominent Freemason amongst the membership of his church, and this man was George Bannerman Delaley, which famously Delaley Plaza is named after, where JFK was assassinated. It is also well known that C.I. Scofield was a member of a prominent club on the East Coast known as the Lotus Club, and this club was filled with prominent globalists and Zionists. Perhaps the most famous man was a man named Samuel Untermeyer, who had connections to the Rothschilds and other groups. So we see that the beginnings and the origins of dispensationalism have connections to Freemasonry, to Zionism, to globalism, and ultimately it goes back to the Jesuits. And we know that the Jesuits are the same people who wrote the High Degrees of Freemasonry and founded the Bavarian Illuminati, and that all of these things go back to a common source, which is the system of Antichrist that we find in the Bible, referring to the system of Roman Catholicism, or known as Mystery Babylon. So in the beginning of the 20th century, dispensationalism became more prominent. It began to expand. And as we came into the 1920s, there was a rise of a movement known as fundamentalism. And fundamentalism was a movement in churches that had good intentions, which was to stand up against the rise of theological liberalism, otherwise known as modernism. But the fundamentalist movement quickly became infested with dispensationalism, and in time, independent fundamentalist Baptist churches would become almost indistinguishable from the theology of dispensationalism. So therefore, the intentions they had of standing up against theological liberalism became subverted by the theology of dispensationalism entering into their ranks. And therefore, conservative fundamentalism and then also evangelicalism became widely rampant by the work of the theology of dispensationalism, and it became the dominant view in many Baptist churches, even in the Southern Baptist Convention, and it took root in many other parts of evangelical Protestantism. In the 20th century, the flagship dispensational school was Dallas Theological Seminary, and it is still a hub for dispensationalism even to this very day. And at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the Left Behind series of novels written by Tim LaHaye further popularized dispensational theology, and especially its eschatology, with its view of one antichrist that would rise on the scene, a pre-tribulation rapture where the church is raptured off of the earth before the tribulation begins, and then the antichrist reigning over the world for 7 years, and the mark of the beast, and all of the pieces of eschatology associated with dispensational futurism. And it is still a prominent view even up to this very day, and this has been the dominant form of eschatology. And it must be recognized that dispensationalism is a theological system that includes much more than simply its eschatology. Its eschatology is the section of its belief system that is most easily recognized. But this system has taken root deep in evangelicalism, and it goes back to theories that were written by Jesuit theologians in the 16th century, which makes it quite suspect because of the fact that we see that the Jesuits, who have worked very hard to infiltrate Protestant churches and to lead evangelical Protestantism or conservative Protestantism away from properly identifying the Antichrist as the Pope, has worked very hard to push dispensational views into evangelical churches and into Protestant churches, and they have been quite successful in doing that, and that is demonstrated by the fact that dispensationalism has taken such a wide stance in the Protestant world, even up to this very day. Now, it needs to be recognized that dispensationalism, as already been said, is a theological system that includes much more than simply its eschatology. And the heart of the dispensational system has always been recognized as their distinction between Israel and the church, where they believe that Israel and the church are two distinct peoples, and God has a separate divine plan for each of them, and that the biblical prophecies throughout the scriptures, really the blessings apply primarily to Israel. And at this point, it can be said that the distinction that the dispensationalists make between Israel and the church is clearly unbiblical, and it can be demonstrated from a number of places in the New Testament. But one verse that can be used to prove this is Galatians chapter 6, verse 16. And Paul here is speaking about the church, and he says this: "And as many as walk according to this rule, peace be on them in mercy and upon the Israel of God." And the context of that verse, Paul is speaking about the church. And we can think of other verses in the New Testament, even in Romans 9, where it says, "Not all of Israel are truly Israel," but we know that when we look at the promises that were given to Abraham, he was promised his literal descendants, and then there are those who are known as his descendants through faith, or his spiritual descendants, otherwise referring to the church. And we see that all throughout the New Testament, we see the truth that the prophecies of blessing are applying to those who have been called out of their sins by faith, otherwise known as the church. And the Greek word for church, ecclesia, means those who are called out. So we see here that this distinction that dispensationalism makes between Israel and the church is completely unbiblical. Now, dispensationalism gets its name from its belief that history can be divided, and biblical history in the Bible can be divided into seven different, quote, dispensations or periods of time, stretching from the beginning of history with the creation week in Adam and Eve, stretching to the millennial kingdom, and then the little season and the end as they see it. And it can be noted at this point that there is nowhere in the Bible where the word dispensation is used to refer to a period of time. And it has been noted that there have been theologians who have even been non-dispensationalist theologians who have spoken of, quote, dispensations, referring to periods of time. So it's not necessarily wrong to speak of a dispensation in that way, but we can also correctly say that we never see the word used that way referring to time in the Bible. But dispensationalism believes in these different dispensations, and the first one has been called the dispensation of innocence. And this is the time of Adam and Eve in the garden, and this goes up until the point of the fall. And then the second dispensation is the dispensation of conscience, which stretches from the fall of man with Adam and Eve's sin, and it goes until the time of the great flood of Noah. And then the third dispensation is the dispensation of human government, which goes from the end of the flood period through the point of the time of Abraham. So this would cover the period of the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations spoke about in Genesis chapter 10, and the peoples of the world being spread out across the world. And this is why it's referred to as the dispensation of human government. And then we come to the dispensation of promise, and this goes from Abraham up until the time of Exodus. And then we come to the dispensation of law, and this stretches from the time of Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt all the way up through the rest of the Old Testament until the time of Christ. And another point will be made on this dispensation in a moment. And then finally we have the dispensation of grace, which is referred to as the church age. And this is the dispensation that dispensationalists claim we are in currently, and this will come up until the time of the Great Tribulation, and then the final dispensation at the end of that period is the dispensation of the Millennium, or the millennial reign of Christ. And this is a premillennial understanding of the millennium, and then that is followed by the little season, and then history will end at that point, and then we will have the new heavens and the new earth according to the dispensationalist timeline. Now, it's interesting that there is usually been a distinction between the older form of dispensationalism called classical dispensationalism, and then the more newer form of dispensationalism has been known as progressive dispensationalism. And I am only speaking very generally about these things and speaking primarily to the older form of dispensationalism known as classical dispensationalism. So I'm speaking somewhat generally. But historically, dispensationalism has believed that God has dealt differently with his people in different ways during each of the different dispensations. And historically, the theology of dispensationalism, and this is found in the Schofield reference notes, that they even believe that during the dispensation of law, that the people of God, the Israelites, were saved not by grace through faith, but were saved by their obedience to the old covenant. And therefore they were saved by their law keeping. And we can see that this is an extremely serious, even heretical theological error. Now, it should be noted that certain newer progressive dispensationalists have distanced themselves from this view or even outright denied it, but there are still dispensationalists even to this very day who believe that. And that's a serious view to take because of the fact that that would mean that God's people have been saved at different times in history, different ways at different times in history, and that in the Old Testament period of the law, that God's people were saved not by grace through faith in the Redeemer, but were saved through their law keeping. And so that has historically been the different views of the dispensationalist views on the different dispensations. Now, there's a number of other dispensational beliefs that have been associated with their theology and their belief systems that can be shown clearly to be unbiblical. And one is, as I've said before, the distinction between Israel and the church. And what dispensationalism does not understand is that the church, those who are called out from their sins, is one spiritual people that is composed of many different nations or ethnicities. And this spiritual people includes both Jews and Gentiles, and that the New Testament is very clear in stating that the wall of partition between the Jews and the Gentiles has been pulled down. And when you articulate a theology that makes this very sharp distinction between the Israelites and the Gentiles and having different plans for them, this really undermines the clear teaching of the New Testament. And this is seen in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. And these verses read, "Wherefore remember that ye, being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision, by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us." So we see here that Paul is referring to the Gentiles, and he's speaking to the church at Ephesus in this epistle, and he is clearly saying that the Gentiles were once strangers to the commonwealth of Israel and stranger from the covenants of promise and having no hope, without God in the world. But then he clearly says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ." And he clearly says that the wall of partition between us has been broken down. The wall of partition between the Jews and the Gentiles is broken down. And this really undermines that distinction that is made in the dispensational belief system between the Jews and the Gentiles. And it should also be noted very clearly that dispensationalism believes that the church and the church age is a parenthesis for Israel. And this is the way that dispensationalist theologians will talk about their theology, that they will often say that the church or the church age is just a parenthesis, that the Old Testament prophecies are referring to Israel, and that in the future, in the millennial kingdom, that is where the blessing will primarily lay. And another verse that speaks to this concept very clearly is Galatians chapter 3, verses 6 through 8. And we see here what is said in these verses. Now this is speaking about Abraham. "Even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Israel. And the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In thee shall all nations be blessed." So what is this saying? It's saying that all of the nations would be blessed in the future through the promises given to Israel. And all of the people who are justified by faith in the future, that is referring to, quote, spiritual Israel or the church. So we see that the church is not a parenthesis for, quote, Old Testament Israel or physical Israel, but we see that God promised in these verses, as the scripture says, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, and preach before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In thee all nations shall be blessed. And that the church is one spiritual people that is composed of people from all of the nations and ethnicities of the world. We see that the blessings of the Bible, they are primarily pointing forward to that people, the spiritual people, which is the church. And this dispensational belief that the church is simply a parenthesis for Israel is quite simply untrue. And another belief system that can be shown to be false is the dispensational belief in a third rebuilt temple. And what they do not understand is that the New Testament is very clear that the people of God, or the church, is called the temple of God in the New Testament. And this can be shown from a number of different verses from the New Testament. One verse in particular that shows this very clearly is 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. And this verse is stating the fact that, once again, that the church is the temple of God, or that the church is the people, or the people of God is the temple. And 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 through 17 say, Know ye not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. So once again, the people of God or the church is clearly referred to as the temple. And we know this, that the New Testament says that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. And this can be shown from multiple verses in the New Testament that are saying that God's people or the church is the temple, and that the Old Testament temple was destroyed alongside the old religion of first century Judaism, and that it is gone, it is done away with, and that the Old Temple points forward to the New Testament temple, which is the church. And so therefore that this belief, it's not merely the fact that they believe, dispensationalists believe, that there is going to be a temple rebuilt in Jerusalem, but they believe that it will be a temple of God. And this leads to the next point, that they believe that the Jews are going to reinstitute the temple system, which will include the system of sacrifices. And that even famous dispensational theologians, for example, John MacArthur, says that these will be, quote, memorial sacrifices that will be given pointing back to Christ. But this entire notion that there's going to be sacrifices performed in service to God by the Jews in the millennial kingdom is something that undermines the finality of Christ's atonement. It undermines the fact that the Old Testament sacrifices that were performed were typologically pointing forward to the perfect atonement sacrifice made by Christ on the cross, in that when Christ died on the cross, he said, "It is finished," and that any notions of future sacrifices undermines the theology of Christ's complete work of the atonement, and that is a very serious theological error that is really verging on blasphemy. And that is a strong statement, but that is really the harsh truth regarding the dispensationalist view of sacrifices being performed in the millennium. And this gives a snapshot of some things they believe that are very serious errors, theological errors. And historically, dispensationalism has referred to other forms of theology, such as covenant theology, as replacement theology. And because covenant theologians, which is usually what Reformed theologians are, have said that the promises of Old Testament and New Testament prophecy are referring primarily to the church. And therefore, dispensationalists have accused them of being, quote, replacement theologians. And it should be noted that historically, that there have been Reformed theologians or covenant theologians in history who have said that certain prophecies in the Bible do apply to Israel. For example, the Puritans believed that there would be a, quote, future conversion of the Jews, and they did believe that the Jews would be regathered in the land of Israel. So just because one denies the dispensationalist belief system doesn't mean that you necessarily have to deny that the Bible has anything to say about the Jewish people in Bible prophecy. And there have been good men who are Reformed theologians who believe in a future conversion of the Jews, and there have been other men who have rejected it. And there is, I believe, some room for spectrum of disagreement amongst good men regarding certain Bible prophecies applying to Israel or not. But it must be noted that, once again, that when we look at the movement of biblical prophecy and biblical history, the emphasis is on spiritual Israel or on the church. So the dispensationalists claim that covenant theologians are, quote, replacement theologians is an unhelpful pejorative that really doesn't do much good for anybody. And it has been noted that many times conservative dispensationalist theologians will make claims that those who hold to other forms of eschatology, such as amillennialism or postmillennialism in all their various forms, are simply theological liberals, and that if you are not a dispensationalist, that you are some form of a liberal. And that is not very helpful, and this kind of goes back to that old view that the old fundamentalist churches, really their theology became indistinguishable from dispensationalist theology. And that really that notion crept into the minds of many men that if you are not a dispensationalist, that you are not biblically conservative, or you are not sound in the, quote, fundamentals. And it should be noted throughout much of the 20th century, the other views of eschatology would often be either idealist amillennialism or preterist postmillennialism, and that these views both had their shortcomings and they didn't really provide any type of a reasonable challenge to dispensationalist eschatology in their own minds of dispensationalists. And the older view of eschatology, known as historicism, which emphasized that the book of Revelation was a timeline between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ, and that it prophesied literal historical events, that view of eschatology had fallen into disrepute, and throughout the 20th century, that view was held by very, very few men. Now, there are some things that can be said about dispensationalist theology, which is somewhat commendable in its as far as it goes. Dispensationalism has usually placed an emphasis on the need of a literal hermeneutic, and this is a commendable and good thing, certainly. But as I have stated, dispensationalism has failed to understand how the New Testament really helps us to understand the meaning of prophecies in the Old Testament. So therefore, even though they have had certain things about their emphasis on hermeneutics that is good, there has obviously been a great deficiency there. And another aspect of dispensationalist beliefs that is helpful as far as it goes is they have placed a great emphasis on trying to understand Bible prophecy. And many dispensationalists have been they have paid very close attention to things going on in the world because they are trying to understand how Bible prophecy is fulfilled as literal history. And this is good as far as it goes. But once again, since they are operating in this completely false scheme that everything needs to be fulfilled within the 7-year tribulation, and they are trying to look at everything in the world and how it fits into this one Antichrist, pre-tribulation, rapture, 7-year tribulation plan, and they're operating from a grid, it's kind of like trying to fit everything. You're trying to build off a false foundation, as it were, and you're trying to fit everything into a grid based on a false presupposition. So even though their emphasis on trying to understand Bible prophecy is good, it has this deficiency that holds it back because they're trying to understand everything through a grid that is not true. And this leads to, once again, their belief in a future. They're trying to understand how Bible prophecy applies to things such as the future conversion of the Jews. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And trying to understand the prophecies of the Antichrist is not necessarily a bad thing either. But once again, their viewpoints on this have their deficiencies. So all this being said, we see that dispensationalism is a very complicated system of theology. It has lots of ins and outs, and to understand it fully takes some form of rigorous study. There's a lot of other things that can be said because they believe that we are under the grace and not law. A lot of times they've rejected aspects of Reformed theology such as Sabbatarianism or, once again, covenant theology, and they would even accuse some people who hold to such things as being legalists. And there's been really a sharp divide between historic Reformed covenant theologians and dispensationalists, and that divide continues up even to this very day. So, but once again, it must be said, if you wish to understand dispensationalism, you need to understand where it comes from. You need to understand its origins in Jesuitism. You need to understand men such as Darby, and understand that men such as C.I. Scofield, and understanding that really the dispensationalist system of theology as we know it in Protestant circles really only goes back to the year 1836. And when you look at theologians in Protestantism before that really none of them were dispensationalists. And when you really understand the clear teaching of the New Testament on Israel, on the church, on the temple of God, on Christ's perfect sacrifice, you see that it is really impossible to hold up this system of theology and hold up this system of eschatology. I didn't talk much about their most famous belief, the pre-tribulation rapture, because I talked about this prominently in my video on the return of Christ. But once again, when you understand the simple teaching of the Bible on eschatology, where at the last day of history there is going to be one final resurrection of the dead for both the just and the unjust, and that the quote rapture takes place on the same day as this, which is the same day as the final resurrection or the final judgment for both the righteous and the unrighteous, and that all these things take place on the same day as the return of Christ, when you understand these things, the greatest distinctive of dispensationalism, the pre-tribulation rapture, is also proven to be false. And it's important for us to understand this system of theology because it is, once again, a very widely held view in conservative Protestantism or conservative evangelicalism, and that even very famous and prominent Bible teachers such as John MacArthur continue to teach it to this day. And if someone's going to navigate their way through the evangelical world, sooner or later they're going to come into contact with dispensationalism, which is why understanding this system, understanding why it deviates from the teaching of the New Testament is very, very important. Understanding its errors is very important, and then therefore understanding where it comes from and what the implications of believing it leads to. All of these things are important for Christians who are trying to understand their Bibles. So as I always say, guys, this is something that should be looked into. It should be studied to understand it, try to understand with discernment, is this system of theology biblical or is it not? Has it been held by godly men throughout the centuries or not? When we look at the Protestant Reformation, Luther, Calvin, when we look at the Puritans, when we look at Spurgeon, Ryle, the men of the Great Awakening, Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, etc., great Bible commentators, Matthew Henry, John Gill, have these men advocated dispensationalism or have they not? So once again, all these things lead back to the question, is the Spirit of God, is it going to lead us to hold to, quote, dispensationalism, or is it going to show us that this is indeed a belief system that has its deficiencies? So as I always say, guys, pray for wisdom about this topic, study it, look into it, understand where it comes from, understand what believing it entails, and God's going to honor that by granting us greater discernment and understanding of this important system of, quote, eschatology and theology as a whole. So that being said, guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless.